And welcome to Politics versus Policy, the Business of Church. I am attorney Delora Butts Lucas, founder and principal of the Business and Nonprofit Legal Center here in beautiful, sunny Daytona Beach, Florida. It is a privilege and honor to be a part of this amazing virtual summit put on by one of my classmates from Vanderbilt, Reverend LaKesha Womack. So I do consider it a privilege. And just a little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned, I'm an attorney, and I actually started this business and nonprofit law practice because of my experience with church law. Prior to starting my own practice, I worked with a firm and primarily did church law. And as I went into my own practice, that was my focus. And I started working with other nonprofits and businesses, and it's expanded to what I have today. But my background is very heavily focused in ministry. Been a licensed minister, originally licensed back in 2001, ordained in 2015. Have served in every aspect of ministry, from worship team to jail ministry to evangelism to altar ministry to associate pastor, and have a heart for missions, have done missions and ministry all over the world on 4 continents. And I shared all of that just to say that I love God and I love God's people. And it is truly my desire to see the church thrive. So just want to share with you this morning a little bit from my experience as it has been in working with churches. So again, the presentation this morning, Politics versus Policy, the Business of Church. And if you could advance to the first slide, please, ma'am. Okay, so the questions that we're going to be answering today are: what documents control how your church is governed? What should be included in those documents? What happens when the documents are silent on certain matters? What happens when the church does not adhere to those documents? And what are the legal duties and responsibilities of church board members and officers? And I titled my presentation the way that I did because in many cases, what we find in church is that they're operating according to the politics of the church and not necessarily the policies that are in place to govern the church. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the first question I would want to ask you and have you to think about yourself is, what is your church's current status? So typically churches operate in 2 forms. If they have not incorporated yet, whether you know it or not, you are an unincorporated nonprofit association. And there are different benefits to incorporating. If you'll go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between those two. So when you're unincorporated, you are essentially bound to and controlled by certain laws that may be in place in your state. So you have restrictions that come along with being a unincorporated nonprofit association. Some of the benefits of incorporating is the fact that as a corporation, you have the same rights and responsibilities as an individual. So your church can buy and sell property, for example. This is a big distinction, and it varies from state to state. I've worked with churches in over 25 states. One state that comes to mind is Virginia, and in that state, in order for you to be able to transfer property, if you're not incorporated as a church, you have to go through the court and get judicial decrees and go through this process and permission essentially to transfer your own property. Whereas if your church is incorporated, that's not something that you have to deal with. You have those rights and responsibilities yourself. And then a big benefit that most people know about is protection, right? Liability, shielding you as the members and the board and directors from liability. And with incorporation, we typically think of the directors and the officers being shielded from liability. But when you're an unincorporated association, not only are your directors and officers at risk for liability, but so are the members of that organization. So moving on to the next slide. Go back just one. There we are. So Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, articles of incorporation. This is the document, the formal document that's required to be filed with the state in order to form a corporation. And sometimes you'll hear that call your corporate charter. Next slide. And inside the articles of incorporation, there are some general provisions that will be required, because this is something that is governed by state law. So corporate name, who your directors and officers are, your registered agent, address, and then very important, you want to have in there a dissolution clause. Some states, if you are going and using a standard form, some states have that in there. But for example, in Florida, that dissolution language is not in the standard form for setting up a nonprofit corporation. And I'm kind of speaking broadly because I don't know if my attendees are actually people that are looking to start churches, already have a church, new churches, or established. So we're just going to cover the whole gamut. And so that dissolution language basically speaks to what happens with your assets if your church is to dissolve. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please. Now, general provisions. I'm sorry, can we go back one? Okay, and then the next document that you want to have are your bylaws of your corporation. So the bylaws of your corporation, you can consider those to be the Bible of your organization. Your bylaws are going to control how your corporation operates and how it's required to operate, and it's going to outline a number of things. So these are the things that you want to include, and it's very important that if you are creating your bylaws, revising your bylaws, that you're working with someone who understands church, and they're not just giving you standard bylaws, but you want your bylaws to be tailored to your church and how you want your church to be run. So general provisions that you want to include in your bylaws: purpose and tenets of faith, selection and removal process for officers and directors, your annual meeting requirements, membership rights and responsibilities, and then your bylaw amendment process. These are things that you want to be addressed in your bylaws. Okay, next slide, please. So what are the bylaws? The bylaws define, as we mentioned, a corporation's purpose, how it will operate, and the duties and responsibilities of the people who manage it. Next slide, please. In your bylaws, you will also have a membership provision. You want to include whether you have members or not. So just because you're a church and your church has members, it doesn't necessarily mean that if your church is incorporated, that those members have to be corporate members in that sense. I've worked with some churches where the membership are actually members of the corporation, and I've worked with some churches where they don't have members as a part of their corporation. So that's something that whoever you're working with and setting up your church or looking at as you're revising your structure, you can speak in detail about that. So if you do have members of the corporation or members of your church, you want to make sure that you list the criteria for membership eligibility, the dues, the rights of the members, the voting rights, and termination of membership. As I've worked with some churches, this is an area that I've seen that has largely been lacking in bylaws. There's typically some general language there about membership, or if there's specific language, the language or the policy isn't being followed. So when it comes down to an important decision that has to be made, are the members required to vote on that? Do your bylaws specify what decisions have to be voted on by members? So you want to make sure to include that. And then when it comes time to make that membership list, who who are the members? Where are these records being held? And are you following your own procedures for ensuring what membership looks like? And that includes membership termination as well. Next slide, please. Now, this is another very important section that you want to have in your bylaws. And for those of you that aren't incorporated, you may have a document that you call your church constitution. So same thing as the things that I'm saying that apply to the bylaws, you can think of that in terms of your church constitution as well. So with your bylaws, you want to have your tenets of faith, your statement of beliefs. This has become more and more important as we're having divergent views and interpretations of the Bible. Particularly, I saw a lot of churches that I've been working with when same-sex marriage came about, and there's some churches that are in agreement with it, some churches that are not in agreement with it. So you want to that's something that you would want to include in your bylaws, because that's going to, in effect, control some of the things that you're able to do and not to do, and allow and not allow. So you want to be sure to include your church's statement of faith and beliefs as a part of your very important governing documents. Next slide, please. Also, in your bylaws, you want to have your board and officer provisions. So how your officers and board members are elected, what are their specific roles, what are the terms of those members and officers, and also include in their duty, the board members' duty to act in good faith and in the best interest of the organization. Also in this part, you want to include indemnification for board members. You want board members to feel comfortable. There are some protections that are automatically afforded because of the law, but you also want to include this layer of protection in your bylaws to say that a board member or an officer that is acting in good faith will be shielded from any type of liability as it relates to their role in serving the church. Next slide. You also want to include a meetings provision in your bylaws. How and where your corporate meetings are to be held and noticed. You want to include in there what action requires a meeting, who and what must be in place for that action to be taken. This is something that is very important. I've looked at some churches, and one church comes to mind in particular, or a denomination where the language was so broad as it relates to who was required to attend a meeting to make an action. It required all of the members in all of the churches in all of the world essentially to be present in order to carry out an action. So you want to make sure with the meetings provisions, with all of the provisions that you have in your bylaws, that you are basically have them tailored to meet the way in which you want to carry out your business and operate. And think about those instances. And I am an eternal optimist. However, as a lawyer, you want to think about when things could go wrong, right? Like with most business arrangements, agreements, it doesn't matter until it matters, right? So you want to make sure that you're addressing these issues up front while everything is going great. I had a particular issue where a church came to me and they wanted to revise their bylaws. One of the board members came to me and I looked at the bylaws lacking in so many areas. And, I said, hey, these are some of the things that I see. Let's work together. They decided not to work together. Later on, they came back to me because there was an issue with someone at the church, high up in leadership, a sexual misconduct issue, and it needed to be handled. And sure enough, all of those areas that I spoke about have needed to be addressed in the bylaws has still not been addressed. And it made the situation much more complicated than it needed to be. So, you always want to make sure to expect the best, but prepare for the worst. Make sure that your bylaws speak to exactly what you want to be happening in your ministry. Okay, next slide, please. Also, in your bylaws, you want to include anything as it relates to compensation arrangements for the directors, for the officers, for the employees. You want to have a conflict of interest policy. Board members and officers, particularly board members, you want to make sure that there's fair dealing between the board members and churches, that board members aren't getting some type of unfair advantage that is against the interests of the church. So the conflict of interest policy will speak to that. And of course, you want to outline and be specific and clear about what the compensation can be. Next slide, please. And you definitely want to include an amendment provision. Be specific about who can amend and what is required to amend the bylaws. Is it a majority vote of the members, a majority vote of the board, a unanimous vote of the board? And I've seen some churches that have bylaws that are in place that were created back in 1950, haven't been revised since. The church is operating and functioning in a completely different manner now than it was then. So it has its own politics that it's created, but its policies are not congruent. So you want to make sure that those things are congruent and you have this provision within your bylaws to be able to amend them. Next slide, please. And then be specific about what it takes to approve bylaws and to adopt them. Another example, I work with the church. There was an issue. I was given bylaws by one faction of the group, came to a certain conclusion, and when we approached the other, I'll just say faction, they came with a different set of bylaws, and there was no record where either of the bylaws had been adopted. No minutes, nothing showing what bylaws were in fact the bylaws that were effective at that time. So, and there had a provision in there about approval and adoption, which it had not been followed. So that's the other thing. You want to make sure that these things are a part of your bylaws, and you want to make sure that you're following these things that are a part of your bylaws as well. Because one thing that could happen, let's say your church takes an action according to the way you've been doing things versus what the bylaws actually prescribe. Well, now the membership or a member or someone could have a cause of action against the church or attempt to have that decision reversed because you're not following your own policies. So if someone is astute enough to say, hey, let me see a copy of the bylaws, and to say, no, the action that you've taken is not as prescribed in the bylaws, this is the way it needs to be done, and then follow the mechanisms of the bylaws to overturn whatever that decision was. So again, I can't stress enough, these are things you want to have in your bylaws, but if you have them already, you want to make sure that you're following them and that your bylaws speak to who you are. Okay, next slide, please. This is a big one. So external connections. You may want to include a provision connecting local church to a governing body. And an example of this would be, let's say you're a part of a denomination. I've worked with denominations, one denomination in particular. One thing that they've done is, even though the local churches are individual corporations, they have required those churches as a part of their bylaws. There's language in the local church's bylaws that connects them to the denomination and particularly as it relates to their ministry policies. So if you're a denomination, that could be something that you could consider. But also, I've worked with churches where it's someone who started a church and it's more of a fellowship or association of churches. Same concept. If you want to be able to connect, this is a way that you can do that. Next slide, please. Okay, so board of directors. As a member of the board of directors of a church or any nonprofit, you have some legal duties. They're called fiduciary duties. A fiduciary duty is basically a legal term describing the relationship between two parties that obligates one to act solely in the interest of the other. So, as a board member of a church, or you may call them trustees, or you may call them directors, but in that capacity, the church has to be at forefront of your mind, not the pastor, but the church. And this is sometimes can be a tricky situation. And so let's look at what these duties are. Next slide, please. Okay, I kind of talked about that. That is a little misplaced slide. We can go ahead. Yes, perfect. So your board of directors, these are the fiduciaries who are going to steer your organization. Your board of directors, they're like the governing body. They're making sure that you're adopting sound, ethical, and legal governance, financial policies, making sure that you have the adequate resources to advance your mission. And even and some churches will include their spiritual aspects, but these are the things that the board of directors are responsible for. Okay, next slide. So let's look at these fiduciary duties that we talked about. These are legal duties that are required at common law, an expectation of board members. So the first duty is a duty of care. And this is important. These fiduciary duties are important because I have seen a number of occasions where the board members are not fully understanding these duties, and in some instances not capable of being able to carry out the role of a board member, but they might have just been put in because their great grandmother was a missionary or mother in the church, or for whatever reason. But duty of care, board members shall give the same care and concern to their board responsibilities as any prudent and ordinary person would. So if you're a board member, you should be actively participating in meetings. You should be engaged, reading and understanding the financial reports. You have a public trust that you have to uphold. It is your responsibility to make sure that the organization is functioning according to its bylaws, its mission, its vision, and according to the standards of actually being a nonprofit corporation and fulfilling its nonprofit purpose. And then the next duty is the duty of loyalty. So, and again, these are legal duties. Board members shall place the interest, not may, shall place the interests of the organization ahead of their own and other interests at all times. This is critical. This is critical. Board members shall publicly disclose any conflicts of interest and not use board service as a means for personal or commercial gain. We talked a little bit about conflict of interest earlier. So again, you just have a duty of loyalty that you are going to always put the organization, as I mentioned, above you, above the pastor. I had a situation where I was working with the church, and I'll say this delicately, there was an issue with one of the leaders in the church, and the leader had a very strong relationship with the board of directors, and the leader was attempting to plead to or appeal to the relationship that he had with the board, but the board needed to make a decision that was not based on their relationship with the leader, but that was going to be to the best interest of the church. That is their duty as a board member, to make those tough decisions. So, it might not be popular. It might not be what you want to do just because of your relationship with someone, but it's what you have to do. Okay. Next slide, please. Fiduciary duty of obedience. Board members shall ensure that the nonprofit is abiding by all applicable laws and regulations and doesn't engage in illegal or unauthorized activities. Board members shall carry out the organization's mission in accordance with the purpose they stated in getting qualified as a nonprofit organization. So you have a duty to make sure that the organization is doing what it said it was going to do. So these duties, it's important for your board members to know and to understand these legal duties, because there could be legal consequences for them not acting or carrying out these various duties. There could be some liability that attaches to your board members for not carrying out these duties. So you want to make sure that you're not opening yourself up for any potential liability as it relates to your role as a board member. And you want to make sure that you're educating your board members on these duties as well, and the level of responsibility that comes along with being a board member, right? It's not just a nice, cute thing to have your name listed as a board member, but you really need to be engaged and active as a board member. Next slide, please. So board expectations, and we're going to move through these a little quickly. In general, these are some expectations that when I'm working with nonprofits, I provide to them to give them a general picture of what they may want to require of their board members. Again, this is outside of the legal duties. Some of these are aspirational, but these are some things you may want to include when you're talking to people about becoming a part of your board. So strategic and organizational planning, ensuring strong fiduciary oversight and financial management, fundraising and resource development. Next slide. Approving and monitoring the organization's programs and services. I've worked with some churches where their bylaws, one church that I'm thinking of in particular, their bylaws clearly specified how the employment was to be done. It specified how the finances were to be handled, but they were not operating in that capacity in any way. The committees that were required to be set up were not set up, and the board's response was, well, the pastor doesn't want to do it that way. Well, the pastor has to operate by the bylaws as well. So if you're starting a church and you have a certain way you want things to run, make sure that's included in the bylaws, right? Because what ended up happening is that board came to me and said, hey, this is what we don't like what the pastor is doing, but he's just kind of taking control. Well, here's what the bylaws say. We can fix that. All right. So enhancing the organization's public image. You're an ambassador, for your church, assessing its own performance as the governing body, taking that annual assessment of the board to say, hey, where are we? Are we doing the things that we should be doing as a board? Next slide. Thank you. And now this gets into the particular expectations of the board members. So we talked about in general, but as a member of the board, these are the things that you want your board members to be able to do. They should know the organization's mission, policies, programs, and be aware of the needs of the organization. Faithfully read and understand the organization's financial statements. Serve as advocates and ambassadors for the organization. Next slide, please. Also, leverage your connections, networks, and resources to fully achieve the organization's mission. And this applies for churches and other nonprofits. Prepare for and attend and conscientiously participate in board meetings, right? You want to make sure that you know what's going on and you are ready to give input, advice, counsel. That's the role of the board of directors. So this also speaks to the kind of people that you want to have on your board that are capable of being able to contribute in this way to your board. Next slide, please. Also, board member expectations, you want to make sure they're fully engaged in identifying and securing the financial resources and partnerships necessary for the organization to advance. Follow the organization's bylaws, policies, and board resolutions. Maintain confidentiality about all internal matters of the organization. Again, these are things that expectations, when I'm working with nonprofits or churches, I'll have this a job description of the board and say, make sure your board of directors, each one of them, they see this, they sign it, they agree to it, so they know what the expectation is. Even before you bring someone onto the board, let them clearly know what's expected of them. Okay, next slide, please. Is everybody able to hear okay? I just happened to look over to the chat and I heard I see two people say they can't hear anything. Okay, some people are saying yes. Okay. All right, so board recruitment and training. You guys okay over there? I know I've just been rambling on. I'm just looking over now and seeing that there's a bunch of comments. Okay, we have a lot of information to get through. So if I don't get to questions, I do have a booth. So you'll be able to come to my booth at the end of the day and we can talk one-on-one as well. I'll be live at the booth. And of course, you can email or call me. I'll give my information at the end of this. Okay, so board recruitment and training. As I was mentioning, you want to make sure that when someone is coming onto your board, that you're getting people that have the skill sets and the perspectives that are going to align with your organization's strategies, goals, and needs, right? So, and you want to have a balance. You know, you may have someone on your board that has an HR background, someone that has a finance background, someone that has a legal background, someone that has a fundraising background, it just depends on what your focus is for your church. But sometimes you don't know what you don't know, right? And if everybody on the board has the same perspective, there's no diversity on your board, then you may be blindsided by some issues, you know, things that you haven't thought of or considered that may be commonly known within other fields or areas. So make sure that you have that diversity of perspective on your board. And then even with recruiting your dream team board, you want to make sure that you train the board on their duties and responsibilities. The information that I'm going over with you is short. There are some board trainings that take a full day or more in order for that board to be trained on exactly what your expectations are for the board. You may have people that are coming in that don't know how to read the financial statements. So maybe that's a part of the training them on the financial statements, training them on how your ministry policies and procedures and protocols work, things that are going to be that needs to be in their knowledge base, so that when they're making these governing decisions for the organization, that they have the knowledge that's necessary in order to be able to make decisions that are appropriate and productive for your particular church or ministry. And next slide, please. And I think we have 10 more minutes. So I can take maybe a couple of questions now. Let's see. I can't scroll through up on the questions, Keisha.
So you do have a question from Monica. Without having a provision for virtual meetings for voting on action items, how can that be addressed or accommodated during these times?
Oh, great question. Well, I would have to look at your church's bylaws to determine what some of the options would be. In some cases, churches may have emergency bylaw provisions in place that allow you to make amendments. And in fact, that's one thing that I didn't mention. You want to make sure that you have an emergency bylaws provision in place. So yeah, I would specifically have to take a look at that church's bylaws or constitution to see what kind of legal solution we will be able to come up with. And when there isn't anything in the bylaws, also there's the law that fills in as well. So there are some legal requirements or some laws that regulate corporations that could speak to areas where your bylaws are silent. So there may be provisions, if not in your bylaws or anything we can do to address it within the bylaws, that are available at your state legal level that would allow that.
And then Latanya wants to know, is there a particular resource or book you would advise for someone who is planting a new church?
Let me think about that. Oh, this is a good, excuse me. This is a good book. It's called Natural Church Development, a guide to 8 essential qualities of healthy churches. But there's also a lot of organizations out there that help with planting a new church. That is something that I can definitely help with as well, just kind of going through the process. I know Start Church is one that is a good resource, and there's a lot of resources online as well that are good for helping you to start a church. But I think that working with, I'm not a church planter, but I can get you set up legally, and I think there's a lot of different aspects that go along with starting a church. But the legal aspects are the ones that I can definitely help you with. And then, okay, yeah, we can take a few more questions. Are there any others? If not, we can go on.
But I do have a question. So talk to us a little bit about how the legal structure impacts a church's ability to get grant funding, because that's the question a lot of people have, is about getting grants, but not understanding the connection to being legally established to be able to apply for those grants.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, everything is going to vary from grant to grant, right? Some may require you to be incorporated in order to get a grant, but there are some that don't require that, but they may require you to get your tax exemption letter from the IRS. For example, a church is automatically granted tax exemption status just by virtue of it being a church, whether it's an unincorporated association or whether you're incorporated. You, by virtue of you being a church, you are automatically tax exempt. However, you can still apply for a tax exemption letter from the IRS. And there are some grants that require that tax exemption letter in order for you to obtain those grants. So it really is going to depend on what it is you're applying for, of what's going to be the best status. But as I mentioned in the beginning, the status of being able to incorporate, I think it gives you a solid footing in the eyes of those that would be issuing money, because it gives you, your corporate documents are going to give you some legal restrictions and limitations that may be more favorable to someone that is going to be giving money to your organization. But it varies from, grant to grant. And then what some churches do is they'll start a community development corporation outside of what they're already doing. And we won't get into this, but another thing that I do with churches is asset protection and management. Like you might have a church and then they also have an apartment complex or affordable housing units, and everything is all under one umbrella. So if something happens, everything is up for grabs. But we talk about asset protection and separating those assets and putting them in different entities. That was kind of a side note, but it just made me think about it as we were talking about that. All right, well, let's go ahead. We just got a couple of more minutes. Last two slides. So what's your next steps? Obtain a copy of the documents that govern your church. Are you incorporated? Are you unincorporated? Is it your bylaws, your church constitution? Review those documents to determine if they align with your church's current beliefs and practices. I was looking at one church, their bylaws hadn't been updated since the 1950s, and it still had in the bylaws, where women couldn't be ministers, and the church had long since moved on from there and had women ministers in the church. So make sure that your documents are reflecting your current beliefs and practices. Assess the competence and performance of your current board and officers based on the things that we talked about. Are your board members living up to those expectations? Do they even know what's expected of them? Do they know their legal duties as it relates to making decisions and governing the church? And then lastly, schedule a consultation with me to address any questions, issues, or incongruencies that you have with your documents and your current beliefs, policies, or practices. And the last slide for us today, we have a Rethinking Church Summit special, which will include a free legal consultation and 15% off any church or personal legal services. So maybe you have some legal services for your own business, your own nonprofit, your own ministry, or something for your church. We'll provide that discount and consultation to you as well. To take advantage of this summit special, send an email to me at dbl@dblucaslaw.com by Friday, July 31st. You can just put in the subject line Summit Special, and then I'll know where this email comes from. And my website is the latter extension of the email there, dblucaslaw.com. So you can visit, learn a little bit more. I have all of the services that I provide laid out there. And again, I just, love God, loves people, and want to see the church grow and thrive and flourish and not have any limitations to what you're able to do in the community and throughout and around the world. So thank you so much, Keisha, for this opportunity to come on and share. Thank you all for those of you that are participating in this session. Again, I do have a booth. So at the end of the day, when we have the booth sessions, stop by if you have questions, and I'll be happy to answer those there.